start by apologizing, Jan, and welcome everyone to our next panel on how esports can contribute to the legacy or public sector. So this is something that we've kind of touched on in many of our previous panels, the impact that esports has on culture, on society, but those are very general terms. They don't specifically deal with this, the legacy of public sector. So I guess just kind of going down the panel and getting some of your thoughts on how esports can contribute to the public sector. So starting with you, Nicholas.
Right, thank you, Reed. Well, the word legacy is a huge word, right? I'm not sure at this stage of esports development whether we are in the position to talk about it, but I think it does reflect the fact that we're taking a long-term view on things, a long-term, hopefully sustainable view on things. I think for perhaps I'll just start with a quick introduction of what we do, if you indulge me, just to introduce. First of all, we're an association in Singapore. We're not yet an IeSF member, so we really thank IeSF for inviting us. We've worked hard, I think, for the past 10 years to try to include all the stakeholders that we work with, from your companies, like your Twitches and all that, to different government agencies. In the past 10 years, we worked with more than 10 different government bodies, and some of my colleagues here from the youth, sports, economic agencies are here. And I think when we talk about legacy, there's a lot of positive stuff, which I'm sure our colleagues here panelists here will mention about the kind of skills that's being developed, the jobs and all that. But the reason why I gave that introduction was because there are stakeholders, there are so many stakeholders from so many different agencies, and besides the industry, and within the government itself, there will be those who look at engaging this trend of esports, which has been around for a while. There are also a lot of concerns. And I think if you look at it from the long-term view, from the legacy perspective, then I think all sides of the house needs to be engaged responsibly, meaningfully. I think as far as the government or the other stakeholders are concerned, they're looking for parties to come in to esports to engage in a very sustainable, responsible manner. So I'll pause there and move on to our other panelists.
There are definitely concerns when we talk about the legacy that esports is leaving. And I think we talked about some of the perceptions and how to change those earlier on in our panel. But moving on to Jan, just talk a little bit about the way that esports does affect the public sector. To Mr. Yarnton, to talk about how esports affects the public sector, and I think specifically when it comes to your work at Gfinity or in that community, what has it looked like to develop public sector effects for esports?
I'd like to sort of just take it back a little bit from just developing the future, is that it's almost a selfish thing, is where you look at it, is by helping develop a legacy, it helps grow the industry. Because it sort of combines a little bit of social responsibility that then gives you more credibility. And if you go back a number of years, 15 years ago, when I was at Nintendo, the mix of the market for gamers was very much male skewed. So to look to try and grow the market, there was 50% of the community, i.e. females, that were not participating as much. So by changing that attitude and creating the fact that video games were not bad for you, we managed to shift the market to increase more female players. And I think if you now move to esports, it's almost a similar reflection where it's heavily male-dominated. And to get more public support and government support, you need to be able to show that it's for everyone. So we try and look at some number of different areas, and I take the Gfinity hat off because I'm also chairman of a group which is the industry, same as CESA in Japan, of the UK Interactive Association. So we have an esports subgroup, and with that subgroup, we're looking to see how do we grow esports and make it more approachable to the community, to the government, and to change people's attitudes. So there's a number of initiatives that we've started, which we believe will leave a legacy. I mean, I don't want to go into too much detail yet, but whether it's starting at the grassroots, so with younger people, and we want to try and show that esports can be positive for their development.
Thank you. And yeah, we'll get to a little bit more of that as the panel goes on. Moving forward, to talk a little bit about the attraction of the legacy of hosting esports events. Some of our discussions yesterday, we talked about kind of the impact that hosting esports events can have on destinations around the world that maybe not on the map for esports just yet, but some of the benefits that esports can bring to different areas and the legacy that they can leave. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we do one big event since a couple of years in Katowice. It's actually something like the Woodstock to a certain extent of esport, with this year 175,000 people attending and people queuing starting at 7 o'clock in the morning to get in. And the whole atmosphere is more like a festival and a rock concert to a certain extent. And this was actually made possible in a city that has problems. It's a coal mining city. I can speak very bluntly about this because it's the city my father was born in. So I visited early on. It's a city with many economical problems, and actually we didn't invent the event in Katowice, but the mayor of the city did, because one day he called ESL and said, I have a great arena and I have big plans, and perhaps one of the ideas could be to host an esport event. And now we are there for this next year for the 7th time, I think, and it completely changed the whole atmosphere in the city. It put Katowice back on the map. It's not now a spot for young people, where young people want to live, and where digital organizations come to have offices there. Beforehand, it was a coal mining city with a lot of problems, and now it's one of those places in Europe where you do your pilgrimage to understand and to party in esport. This is just done by the creative idea of a mayor, which is absolutely great.
It's just seeing some of the effects, but go ahead.
I think one of the great things about that, apparently, I've heard from the city's investment, I think it's about $2.5 million. They get back something like 65 to 70 million, and it counts for about 20% of the city's gross domestic product. And it's sort of amazing to think that esports has basically done that.
Yeah. I'm not commenting what they're investing because it's relevant for our P&L. But apparently you have to travel over 100 kilometers to get a free hotel room during these days. So you have 10,000s of tourists during these days.
It's a very real world kind of public sector effect of esports, and I think it's been very successful there, and I think more and more nations around the world are starting to kind of see at least that specific kind of public sector impact from esports. But to move on to Mr. Ashton there at the end of the panel, what have you kind of noticed in your years of reporting on this as some of the bigger impacts that esports has had on the public sector? What kind of legacies is it leaving?
I'm inclined to agree with Nicholas when he said that legacy is a really big word, in the sense it might even be a little premature to start thinking about the long-term impact esports would have in terms of legacy. But the way you think about then is like what kind of seeds you need to sow now in terms of what programs you want to start, and you can look at sports as a good base for that in terms of what areas of the public sector does sport have that is inseparable. That you can't have a public sector without those areas of sports, and the key one is education. So when I started reporting for the Esports Observer, one thing I immediately was interested in is all the different educational programs based around esports. Now, I don't know how it is in Korea and perhaps China, where they're probably a bit more developed, but in the West, I started picking up on small little programs that were developing. So obviously you have the college scene that's really expanding in Europe and in America. But the one that really struck me was there's a university in Finland, for example, Kanyani, that started a CSGO summer camp, where it basically invited a group of players, and over the summer they would go and they would train together, and they would learn other things aside from the game. They would learn business skills, they would learn ethics. IeSF was involved with that, And then at the end of the camp, they would then have a tournament with a couple of Tier 2 CSGO teams. And they would actually earn credits that could be used to their higher education. And to me, that's a perfect, the summer camp is the embodiment of childhood. And I just like the idea of embedding it within education in a way that, it's not ham-fisted, it's not, it fits quite nicely with a typical childhood experience. I mean, maybe CSGO, I don't know if that particular game would work everywhere, but either way, I think those kind of initiatives, those kind of programs is how you can start to inject esports into an educational environment without it, ruffling the wrong feathers.
If I can add just maybe a little plug for what we've been doing on the educational side of things. We started with some boot camps for the past few years, and this year, I think some of you might have read an Esports Observer you reported for us. We launched our Esports Academy. Have been funded by the National Youth Council, as well as partners with industry like players like Twitch, Super Evil Megacore, and different guys to help us help with the programming. And the way that we had about 500 people pass through it in the first 6 months of the academy. We started with some basic skills and all that, and next year we're looking to launch a couple of full-time diploma programs. And the way we look at it, I just wanted to expand a little, was we look at the top 1 to 5% of the esports people looking to how to excel and do well in esports. We think the real opportunity and the value add, and when we have a discussion about legacy, is really the next 10-20%, those who've spent a lot of time, invested a lot of time in esports and all that, and maybe they didn't manage to go professional, they didn't make their $1 million and all that. What are the opportunities for them? How can we highlight some of those skills, whether in the business, in the industry, enterprise of esports? And we're also beginning to see that even beyond the 20%, there's some opportunities for us in education. For example, we've seen esports professionals, they've gone on to do well in maybe games design, games development. They've gone on to even succeed beyond games in industry like finance, sales, and all that. So we're not focusing on that right now, but it's something that we think we need to work on down the road to really then talk about legacy and how education plays a big part in that.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, I've interviewed a lot of players, and the one thing I always ask is, once you hang up your headset, what are you going to do next? And so if you're going to integrate esports into the public sector, you need to really do it in a way that actively promotes opportunities for the players to then escalate to the next part of their career. I mean, I spoke recently with a League of Legends player, a German one, Dexter, who has now started his own talent agency. So throughout his years playing League of Legends, he studied law, he spoke with a lot of lawyers, and he decided, okay, now that I'm kind of done with my playing, it's time for me to start building, ways to make sure other players have perhaps the kind of protections and opportunities that I didn't necessarily have during my professional career.
Yeah, perhaps adding to this, from a commercial side of it, we are getting a lot of positive feedback from brands in terms of employer branding. They're approaching us because they say, well, we need new engineers, we need new smart people working for us, and where do we find them? We find them at your events. So they learned this pretty much earlier than the public sector normally does. We were extremely happy that Chancellor Angela Merkel was opening Gamescom this year and said that e-sport and gaming is a cultural good. We were positively shocked because that was a sensational thing. Never experienced something like that before. So I think there's a huge potential, just like we said yesterday already. It's inclusive, it's global, it's about fair play. You need technical skills, and you need coordination skills. There's a huge potential in that.
I just want to sort of take it to a more younger stage and what actually esports can do to help leave a legacy, rather than necessarily what the community can do for esports, so to speak, a bit like John F. Kennedy as such. But we started an integrated program. One of the big weaknesses in the UK educational system was young people were not studying what we call STEM subjects, which is science, technology, engineering and maths. So to try and encourage them at a much younger level to get involved in those sorts of areas, as an industry association and majorly sponsored by Sony, we created what we call Digital Schoolhouse at a younger level. So there was a number of teachers that actually didn't have the skills to be able to start teaching younger kids computational thinking and looking at very basic programming. So we've basically been training the teachers and then having special classes for the students. Now, it all seemed very dry and very dull and boring to a lot of these young kids who sort of, oh yeah, it's just, more study. So we then implemented an esports competition for the students, and then it culminated in a final from all the schools that were involved, and they started getting much more involved in the study as well, because they saw this as an avenue for them to, a combination, have fun. But it developed a lot of other skills that the teachers started saying was really positive, i.e. some of these students who normally wouldn't necessarily participate in events at school, i.e. sport or other activities, started becoming much more open and mixing with other students. They started developing teamwork. And after they've finished the whole program, the ones that participated in the esports competition, the survey they did came back that 87% of them looked then to pursue much more vigorous study in those subjects that we were looking to try and get. So the teachers found this whole esports experience very positive, and so it's starting to roll out now to more and more schools to encourage the kids that, hey, but we're not just saying you just play games, because part of the whole thing is the other aspects that go with it.
I'm mindful that we might be preaching to the choir here on the positive aspects of it. Maybe I want to call out a little bit of some of the conversations that been having. Like last month, we had a member of parliament come and ask me, hey, Nick, gaming, esports, great. How dateable are these gamers, right? And now we know from yesterday that actually we have very dateable gamers, and that's my point to her, that some of these gamers are really popular and all that. But I think when we talk about the legacy conversation, we also want to think about when we put out like the top gamers and all that, the kind of role models that they are, the kind of values that they espouse. One of the first top gamer in Singapore who actually went to BlizzCon and won like second prize. He came back to Singapore. He got into drugs and gambling and all that, and then disappeared from the scene. So that's not a very great story to tell, right? When we visit like more than 30 schools, and over the years maybe 100 schools, and oftentimes when we finish our engagement and all that, the teachers will say, hey, I have this 5 students, 10 students who stopped turning up to school because they're playing too much games and all that. What can you do about it? We're like, what can we do about it? We've been thinking about it. Is it our job? Should we do something about it? And we realized that, well, it's not our focus, but at the same time, if we can do something to help, we would. So now we're partnering with a social agency that runs like a boys' home and try to see where we can run some esports programs with them for engagement. And just one last thing, right? Recently, one of the ministers in Singapore came to me and said that he's really concerned about gambling in esports, super concerned, right? And he's concerned about young folks, young kids, as maybe as young as 9 or 10, placing bets, whether real money or coins and skins and whatever, and they're really concerned. And I think if we don't manage expectations and stakeholders and all that, then it could affect the kind of long-term sustainability and legacy that esports have.
Right, not just positive legacies to be left, but concerns about the potential of negative legacies. So what is being done to make sure that the legacy that esports leaves is a positive one? I know there are or have been negative side effects. Is there any work that is being done to, I guess, alleviate or make sure those negative possibilities, or curb them into more positive directions?
I think part of the next stage on that we've been looking at is, and I think Ashton sort of touched on it before, about the legacy for players afterwards, and you just mentioned about a player that went off the rails from retirement. One of the things I think, and part of all we talk about, is the professionalism, and professionalism isn't necessarily about being a professional player, but it's how the infrastructure is organised, how the players and people involved become more professional as far as a business. So we've moved from the stage I was talking about earlier with Digital Schoolhouse is probably a late primary, early secondary type of area. We then now start developing some actual educational programs, which there's 2 different aspects we're working with as far as the industry, with a company called AIM, which does what we call NVQs, which is non-vocational qualifications. So it's basically aimed at students that probably aren't going to go into university who are sort of getting to the end of school that they really don't, as you were saying, don't want to turn up. So they've been looking at subjects that actually appeal to them, and basically in the esports area. And so it's not just about playing the game, it's about actually developing them in tournaments, looking at the marketing, looking at how they develop various skills. And by giving them those sorts of, very early on the base, giving those sorts of basic skills maybe help keep the interest afterwards. And then the second phase is next year in 2018, we've been working with Staffordshire University, who will be launching a Bachelor of Arts majoring in esports. And part of that is the fact that we're saying it doesn't want to just focus on esports, it's got to be skills that are across different areas in events and media, so that if they don't finish in esports, they can move over, transfer those skills, because we don't want to be too narrow. But there's a lot of, as you say, positives esports can bring, but we're trying to make it more professional, more quantifiable, so that people that don't understand esports can understand some of these things.
You mentioned being able to translate your studies or your work in esports to other additional fields if they don't work out. So sustainability, the ability to leave a legacy, is very important. So what are some of the requirements? And of course, I'm going to open this up to everyone on the panel. What are some of the requirements to create a sustainable esports legacy that continues?
I think I mentioned a bit about our focus on educational efforts, and I think we've just started out. We feel that we just started out. We've just been doing it for a year. I think our educational efforts needs to be a lot more comprehensive. It needs to be a lot more nuanced in terms of how we look at education. We're working with both the Ministry of Education and looking at, they're funding some of our programs, and we're also then looking at doing a diploma program with them, as well as even with the private sector and looking at programs that the private education providers can work on. At the same time, we're laying foundations about things like national platforms, whether like national leagues, national tournaments, rules and standards and all that. So it has to be looked at across the board.
I mean, over the last couple of days, a lot of people have spoken about how esports is such a new phenomenon compared to some of the other sports that have been around for over 100 years. And they've developed a sort of infrastructure and they developed a sort of background. If you look at, say, a football team which may only have 11, I talk about proper football with a round ball, not American football, things like that. But football with a round ball, they might only have 11 players on the pitch, but behind that, the number of people that go to support. I mean, we're not quite at that stage yet, but I mean, we're talking about, Casper talking about some of the educational programs they've been doing with their players in the psychological area and all those sorts of things. And I think this is part of the legacy is as we develop, it doesn't just mean getting involved in esports as being a player, but it's the other areas that can offer some opportunities. So, as clubs, as we talk about fantastic new Rossetti 700-800 million esports stadiums being built, with an inverted dome, there's going to be a lot of people needed to run those things. So, these are the sorts of things that leave a legacy, is the fact that other people start getting involved in it, and esports actually provides, I suppose, a bit like, I want to say a farm, provides sustenance for so many more people than just the people that work on the front line, on the tractor, field, in the fields. It flows back down. And so there's few people up there, I think, can start supporting a lot of other areas. And to me, as esports gets bigger, it creates a bigger environment and community from a lot of different areas.
Adding to this, I think what we could learn from classical sport is that we have to evangelize people. We have to talk about it. We have to spread the news that esport can furnish society with all those good things. We've been, I think, in recent years too defensive and perhaps even too modest, and we should tell people, and millions of people don't know, and many politicians and many people in administration still don't know what esport is about and what esport can support. And if you have only a brief glimpse at classical sport, I mean, they are always making the impression that they can save the world, basically, yeah? And they are only good, huh? And we don't have to exaggerate, but if we would if we could just learn 50% of what they do on a daily basis, this would be great. Yeah.
Let's just, but a couple of people said about legacy is a big word. I always find it's almost a negative word. I mean, legacy I think of is when someone dies and they say, what legacy did he leave the world, you know? To me, I don't think esports is necessarily going to die. So to me, it's about what we can develop for the future as such and make it much more sustainable. And I was just sort of thinking about sort of some of the sort of things that, you know, really make it much more positive on a long-going basis. And there's almost opposite spectrums of what esports is all about compared to, say, something like a library, you know, with books. It's very quiet, dull. Well, not dull, because there's lots of interesting information there. But we've had some experiences in the UK where we brought the two together, which sounds really weird. Esports and a library, you know. What was happening, and it's like a lot of, say, traditional sports where their numbers are declining as far as their demographic, as far as age goes, they're getting older, not getting the younger people. And it's the same with libraries. You know, people aren't going to libraries because they do everything online. So we did a trial of using these premises because they're generally set up quite well with internet and areas to be able to do. We started esports clubs there for a trial period of 4 weeks with Westminster Council. And it was basically for kids from 8 to 12 years old. And the first week we do it for 2 hours every week. And the first week we had about 8 turn up. Second week, there's about 20 coming, and then we were full by the end of it. And the library actually really enjoyed it because it said, even though there was a quiet buzz about it, it was getting kids back into the building. And then the kids enjoyed it because it was starting this social community. And I suppose it's a little bit like, I think with Kesper talking about the esports clubs, but we don't have in the UK, you know, PC bank cafes, things like that. So where do they go? So we're using an existing infrastructure that may be struggling a little bit to help each other.
We have worked with our National Library for 5 years. We co-created a program called Game to Read. So, you know, kind of like, it was for them to try to get more young people to the library. It had a bit of a rocky start. We managed to do a program where we have 5,000 youths who come up to the library every year when we run the program. It eventually culminated in the library saying that we want to do a gaming library. So a library just for like books related to games, multimedia and all that. It was a small library, but the numbers shocked us because I think the first 3 months, that library was the top loans. All the books, when you look at the library, all the shelves were empty. All the books were flying out of the shelves. It was empty. When I walked in there, I was like, is this library not set up yet? Say, no, all the books are loaned out, it's gone.
I think the kids probably told their parents, I'm going to the library to study. They go and play games. They had to take a book back to say, Mum, look what I got.
I think that maybe, like, instead of legacy, the word should be using as foundation and kind of building things from the initial point. I did a podcast a couple of months ago with 2 sports psychologists that are now working in the EU LCS. And as I kind of alluded to yesterday when I said, like, a lot of what we're doing right now is experimentation. You know, whilst they've had training that has been developed over the last few decades in sports psychology, when they apply it to esports, it's completely different. It's a completely new field. And everything they do is going to basically affect everyone that comes afterwards. So now they're starting to develop training methods and organizations and build and kind of an apprenticeship style scheme that will be able to then affect all the people under them. And what you want to do is, rather than have a few individuals that are talented and gifted in having these specific set of skills, you want to try and entrench them, again, in education, in literature, or what other resources. I think at the same time, like, there's a real lack of resources right now. And the hope is that once it gets more integrated in education, we can also start building more academic studies in esports, like actually producing more academic resources, which are, I mean, at this point, virtually non-existent.
All right, just to try to follow up on, I think we've talked extensively about the educational side of this, but as I would imagine most of you come from the public sector and now work more traditionally with esports, or more specifically with esports. What is it that, I mean, I think of esports, at least from my job, as more of like a public speaking, like a commentary kind of role, as something that is, you know, or previously has been very generic and is now specifically applied to esports. So when it comes to fostering or nurturing new jobs in esports, what is it that I guess people interested in that should be looking for. The specific point here is how to promote that. We've talked about using libraries or schools as points of education, but when it comes to the jobs being created, I mean, what is it that is being promoted as relatable to esports?
I think perhaps this is where we have opportunities to work more closely with industry players like ESL and kind of like when the multiple stakeholders work together hand in hand to kind of grow the pie, if you like, and then more jobs could be created and all that. Some of these require more leadership in the sense that we need to really highlight these are the pathways. And if you spend time in esports, these are the opportunities, and a lot of the convincing has to be with the parents. But I actually take the approach that we evangelize a little bit less. We like to build the rails a bit more to make sure that opportunities are there, that when the parents see, because we speak to a lot of enlightened parents, they come to us and say, hey, my son loves to play games. What kind of job opportunities can he have? They come to us, they write to us almost weekly, asking us about these things. I think we realize that it's easy for us to say what the opportunities are, but really the real work for us is really building and building takes time. It takes time to say that, to create some of these jobs, to work with the different industry players and stakeholders for these jobs to be created.
You mentioned about coming from the public sector. I always think the public sector is government and not profit organisations.
Public or business sector.
So you're saying business sector as well, because that's my background as business.
Okay, exactly.
But the other things we do because we want to try and help the community. So to me, that's part of when you start looking at esports in a commercial sense, things they can do to help the community, being the public sector. And I don't want to sort of look at a history of esports, but one of the big things that you see the rise and phenomenon people say is because Twitch came about and made it much more accessible. People could, online. And so if you look at esports and the people that are involved in it and players and everyone involved in it, they're much more switched on to, say, technology and picking it up a lot quicker. This is the new generation. They've grown up with it. They've started, and they start when they're young. And so what the experience they have is really huge of what they can give back as far as in the technological sense. And you look at, as I think we were talking before yesterday about traditional sports and esports, how the synergies can look there together. We said traditional sports bring some of their professionalism, all the sort of dietitians and trainers. Well, esports can bring back the knowledge that the young people there have as far as technology goes, and especially with esports, with streaming and those things. And this is what the world makes it much more open and much more accessible. So to me, these are some of the things that the people that within esports can give back to the community as such, is this sort of knowledge of communication. And people think esports is not a social type of pastime. You just see it. But it is so social. The players and that, and the people watching online, the chat that goes on. These are sorts of things that can be brought, I think, to other communities of how it is. And there's no sort of boundaries. There's no countries as such that have walls when you're playing. So these are sorts of things, and more than just technology, but more is the sort of social interaction that can really benefit.
It's going to really largely redefine the way the public sector will interact with the esports demographic. I mean, that's what it's becoming now. It's a demographic. And we saw that a lot in the recent South Korean elections, where there were the winning candidate obviously released a set of StarCraft maps as part of his campaign. Another one released an Overwatch play of the game style video. I noticed in the last UK elections there were a few think pieces on what all the different parties think about esports. Jan mentioned when Angela Merkel came to Gamescom, well, there were many other representatives from many other parties there, and it was kind of election time. So they're all starting to realize that the esports demographic is very unique. They're obviously all digital native. They're all quite young. They kind of look at it the same way all the sponsors look at them, but they're obviously the goal is quite different. And what this ultimately means is the way they interact with them, whether it's handing out DLC, custom maps. That's something that you wouldn't have imagined a politician doing some time ago. It completely changes the way that electorate and elector are going to interact with each other.
just to kind of gauge your personal opinions, we do see like esports, like you mentioned, some of the ways that they're being integrated into applications that you wouldn't necessarily expect. And I know there are quite a few people attending this esports summit who may not have a background in esports, but are looking into it as it gains popularity. Where do you think esports stands? I mean, you would imagine there would be politicians who would think it was ludicrous to include in their list of positions their position on esports, right? So do you think it is a large enough demographic where it can start to have that kind of influence, whether it's politically or in a global economy or culture? Has it gotten to that point, or is it still looking to grow further?
I think one of the big things with people in esports, or especially the community as such, even though sometimes fake news goes out, it is soon found out about if it's in esports, because the community talks so much. So with politicians starting to get involved, some of it is quite cynical, and the community knows that, and they look at it with a little bit of grain of salt. So there's sort of certain areas that I think with the community, the esports community as such, is this whole sort of keeping it real. So the biggest worry, I mean, I remember many years ago, and this probably may not translate culturally amongst everyone here, but years ago there was a skating brand called Echo. It was a sort of rhinoceros on the front and Echo, and it was really cool. All the skaters wore it. But then as soon as the dads started wearing it because they wanted to feel young, the brand died. And there's this whole thing a little bit with esports, is it's a subculture type of feel. And there's a sort of two-edged sword. We want it to grow, we want it to be popular, but if it becomes too mainstream, could it lose some of that popularity? But I think there's a balance. And this is where sort of maybe the rest of the community, there's going to be this sort of hybrids of esports, the sort of real one side. And as I say, I think the big thing is the whole communication, how various communities and government relate to it is really important.
Maybe just to share for Singapore, we are quite a unique country. We have 5 million population, really, really small. The estimates of number of gamers in Singapore is 2.9 million, so that's over 50%. And I think I estimate the number of people involved in esports slightly over 10% in that sense. So really interesting numbers. And we looked at, and we have a division in our Prime Minister's office that they talk to us quite often. They look at scenarios only beyond 30 years. So I'm not sure how many governments have that, but it's quite unique to us that they will, and we talk about a range of, we're not trying to predict the future, we're looking at the range of possible scenarios in the future, and where does gaming and esports play in that. So one of those conclusions that at least I've arrived at is that is an inevitable eventuality that as all the youth today, they're playing, so many of them are playing games and esports and all that. They grow up to be parents and all that. So is it our job to accelerate the acceptance of esports and gaming, or is it more important for us to really build the rails, to really build the infrastructure and all the things that we talked about, the education, the careers and all that, so that when that day comes, then we're kind of ready for that future, which we think is a given.
Yep, when that day comes.
Just on that, you talk about the gaming community. I was at a presentation about 2 weeks ago, and I can't remember whether it was Facebook or Google or probably YouTube talked about. They said globally there's like 2.5 or there'll be 2.65 billion gamers in the world, people playing games, and their definition of a gamer obviously is quite wide as far as someone with a mobile phone. But when you look at the esports, we talk about, I think, 250 million people globally that are interested in esports. That's only 10%. So it's still a long way to grow, and we're in a really good position, being such a young sort of industry, and all these things we're talking about, is to make sure that as we grow, it's grows in a positive way, and because there is opportunity, and then we can maintain that infrastructure.
All right. Any final comments? I'd like to maybe take a little bit of an early trip to questions and answers, because I think this is something that's very applicable that we might have quite a bit of questions for. So any final comments on this, the legacy or public sector applications of esports before we move on? Okay.
Maybe a story to help to contextualize.
Okay.
And this is a story I've shared with our finance minister, or deputy finance minister, and said that there was a gamer in Singapore. He was playing professionally for a year. He made some money, 30,000 US, not a lot. Came back to Singapore and he was a bit disoriented. All his friends were moving on ahead in their careers and all that, and he was like stuck in time. And then he tried to do a few things and all that, and wasn't very successful. One day he got hired by a company doing high frequency trading on a finance, like on finance floor and all that. And we were surprised. Apparently he got hired over candidates that had Harvard MBAs and PhDs. Apparently. So we were like, let's see how quickly this guy gets fired, right? Let's he didn't get fired. 3 years later, he's the most senior trader on the floor, most successful. And then I met the boss 6 months back and said, this is such a successful experiment. I'm going to hire all his teammates who played Counter-Strike with him. And so he hired the entire team, so you talk about legacy, you talk about future. I think we're just the beginning of a curve. I think there's lots of potential, and I think one of the things for us is to be seen as a responsible partner to the stakeholders, to the government, and all that, to help them to explore and enter into this environment in a safe way.
All right, well, thank you. That's a perfect segue into some questions from our audience. So if you guys go ahead and open or raise your hands, we will open the floor to all of you. So it looks like we have a question from Matt in the front row.
So you told that great story, but you didn't tell us the secret sauce. Why was he successful, and how's that other experiment going?
We can theorize, right? Because we didn't do a study on that, but we think that some of the principles that that made him successful was the fact that not just the fact that it was high frequency trading, so he had to be fast, he had to take in a lot of information very quickly, process them very quickly, and most importantly, apparently, the biggest trait that he brought to the job was being able to make a decision without hesitating, because a lot of the MBAs and PhDs that they hired were hesitant. After they collect all the data, hesitant to execute on that trade. And I think he was able to do that. And the reason why they hired the rest of the team was then they could work like a Counter-Strike team, where there was a coach and manager who was working and can them say, okay, you lost this trade, now get yourself back, go to the next trade and all that. So running a trading team like a CS team, and that experiment just started. I think that team is ready to trade live in January next year. Yeah. I mean, they've been training as a CS team on the trading floor for 4 months, I think. Yeah.
I shouldn't really say this, but I sort of feel that we're amongst friends as such, that when we bring teams in from overseas into London after a tournament on the Sunday night when they finished, and this is only the ones over 18 years old, nearly all of them want to go to the casino to play cards because of this sort of, and they always generally make money because their reaction times, their thought process, and all those sorts of things are so much quicker and better than the other people that are there. And they only do it for a bit of fun because, you know, they're responsible, but that's sort of the same sort of, that's, you know, stock markets, gambling and all that sort of stuff. Anyway, it's all the same.
Depends on who you talk to.
All right, I think I saw a couple of other hands over there. Yep, right in the front row.
Thank you. Hi. Mr. David mentioned how we all want to see the esport growing, but again, we don't want it to be too mainstream, so it loses its, you know, it's vibrant. So how do you see a movement like the Overwatch World League jumping and making this a huge franchising, and then esport teams selling out for non-endemic brands just to secure a spot? How do you see such movement affecting the esport ecosystem in terms of growth and in terms of losing its value as an esport competition and becoming more like a brand competition?
Some people say that a rising tide, all ships will lift. And if you look at sort of positive things happening and those sorts of big things, they actually attract the media attention, which normally maybe esports wouldn't get some of that coverage. Going back, a friend of mine, he's developer who develops Football Manager, which is owned by Sega, and he was saying that his mother never knew what he did, and he's very involved in the games industry in the UK, and he got given an honour, he got given an OBE and he's still only very young, and he said his mother then went, now I understand that games, you know, how good it is, you've been recognised by the Queen. So when we start having the Overwatch and non-endemic brands coming in, it helps people that don't understand esports. If these people are getting involved, if it's starting to develop there must be something positive or something worthwhile there. So even though it sort of is, as you say, taking away, maybe becoming this more professional, it can only, to me, be good as far as creating higher recognition, you know, more wider public knowledge of what's with esports.
Yeah, just to add to that, you know, what ultimately helps esports succeed in the same way that sports has succeeded is good storytelling. And brands and their marketers and marketing agencies are generally pretty good at building campaigns that allow their brands to be visible but not like omnipresent, so they don't obscure the players and what they're accomplishing. And in terms of like you referenced the Overwatch League in particular, and I mean it'll be interesting to see like how they enact that. So for example, the first jersey sponsor was announced recently, and if you can compare it to the way sponsors are normally done in esports, it's like so for those who don't know, the team is Dallas Fuel, and their first sponsor is Jack in the Box. It's a fast food chain in America. And the logo is kind of just there, like on the jersey, small. Whereas in most esports competitions, like the jerseys are completely covered in logos. And I think what they're building towards is they want the brand to be not just like a logo that's placed on a shirt, which I think the problem with branding in esports is like the best you can do, like if you do it wrong, then the best you can hope for is indifference, that the players just don't care. That's the best result. I think what we'll see with the Overwatch League is that they're going to, yes, I think the brands will be very integrated into the competition, but they'll take that kind of hint from traditional sports and use them in a way that is more integral to the team. So we might see like sponsored stadiums, we might see sponsored gaming houses. I think it won't be as kind of simplistic as it has been so far.
I mean, the whole thing with non-endemic brands, with esports, and people saying, you know, it's not right. I mean, ESL have had a fantastic promotion with Mercedes, which people think, hang on, Mercedes and esports, you know, how many esports guys are going to buy a Mercedes? But it's their whole way of they're looking to the future to say, you know, we create the aspiration, and they also are looking at the fact that people in esports, as I say, are very much digitally savvy. And you know, a lot of the technology Mercedes are putting into cars, and you know, as the future comes with driverless cars, the people that are into esports are probably going to be the first people that will accept that sort of technology. You know, they're early adopters of things. So all these brands that have been sitting on the sideline, and sometimes they say, well, it doesn't make sense, but if they're thinking about it, they're looking for the future. I mean, Gillette, I think, do a lot of stuff there now too, and people say Gillette, but you know, hey, a lot of the guys don't shave, but some do shave. So you know, it makes sense that these brands are starting to get involved for their future customers in the future and start there. So there's some really interesting things that are starting to happen in that space.
I can only support this. Regarding Mercedes, we just made the experience in Hamburg when we introduced Mercedes into the ESL 1 Dota 2 world, and the moderator, at one stage he said, this was a great game and it's just as great as the new Mercedes so-and-so, which is that wasn't the perfect idea to how to put it. But what happened was not that a lot of criticism, a shitstorm came, but everybody embraced that. This went viral, and everybody just loved it. And another example, we have another partner, Wüstenrot. They are selling finance products. So if you want to build a house when you're 35 or so, you can save. They help you save the money. It's a finance product. Yeah. And they're aiming at people between the age of 18 to 25. This is a real challenge. I mean, selling a product that you need in like 20 years to somebody who doesn't know what he wants to do tonight, or whether he's still in love with Rebecca tomorrow. So it's a real challenge. And the experience they made is they're being stalked by esports supporters. They are actively contacted by people saying, "Well, I saw your brand there at the ESL One. What do you do? Tell me." They are positively shocked. So right now the atmosphere is still very positive for brands, and I'm not commenting on the overall thing. Let's see whether this will be sustainable. But right now it's actually the best time to go into esport for non-endemic brands.
All right, thank you very much. Let's see if we have any more questions out there. I see a hand in the back, right over there.
We got some questions about we're from Taiwan, and Taiwan's actually really have a good relationship with the school members and all the schools in Taiwan. And I want to know how you guys have a further progress between the education and those organizations. Because in Taiwan, we have a hard time to open the class because we can't find any resource. Esports player, we're all from the esports player, and we play the game, but when we go to professionally explain to our experience and all the professional information, we have a hard time to find the resources. Actually, we have to go back to the library to searching those information. So I want to know how further you guys are working on with those school or educationally between the esports player.
I'm not sure I fully understood the question, but let me take a stab at it. It took a while. I think when we first entered into schools, it was a bit rough, right? So the schools were wondering how what we're trying to do and all that. And I think we had success in quite a few. Those schools that were a bit more adventurous. And those maybe had more gamers in the midst. It's hey, we got nothing to lose, and then let's get Skoga to bring some professional gamers to come and speak to our students, and the reception was very positive. I think from there, then the schools kind of introduced us to other schools, and it started from there almost 10 years ago, and we didn't go progress very far. We attempted and we tried. I think as we took into consideration concerns from stakeholders like Ministry of Education and all that, we tried to also go into very deep educational programs like keeping ourselves safe online, cyberbullying, a lot of that. And our message always gets received better than if someone else delivered it, because it was delivered by a gamer, a peer, somebody that a lot of youths could recognize, and I think it helped. It helped, but we asked ourselves if that was something that we should focus on too much. And right now, we think we are in an interesting place because the Ministry of Education has agreed to fund our academy in a quite a significant way. That's one aspect of it, and we think that's a breakthrough, number one. Number two is that we actually have a government-registered institute looking to launch the full-time diploma with us, so we think that's another breakthrough. And I think that my summary to your question, if I understood it correctly, was the fact that I think we took time to build a track record and show ourselves as a responsible party that could, and that we try not to break too many things along the way, and eventually, I think like I mentioned, we don't see it as much as a priority for us to be evangelizing, doing a lot of advocacy work. More important as in doing the right things, and oftentimes maybe behind the scenes, maybe not necessarily running big, huge, sexy events with hundreds of thousands of millions of people. We have some of those, but I think what's the work in the background, the rails that we're building, I think the infrastructure work that we're doing behind the scenes is really important. I hope that kind of gives you a sense.
Yeah, I think we're pretty lucky to some extent in the UK that the government has recognised that the creative industries where video games and esports sort of comes under that umbrella is a really important cornerstone for the future of the country as such, and that we need a much smarter community as far as in education. So we get some good support there, to the extent that in the UK, one of the government departments is called the DCMS, which is the Department of Community, Media and Sport, and they've changed it now, and it's Community, Media, Sport and Digital. And so I met a few ministers, they always joke about the minister there that he's now and digital. So they see these areas as being really important. And so as we develop these outreach programs at the schools, we tend to get a lot more support from the education department that's starting to say, yes, we'll give resource as far as teachers' time and availability. And then basically as an industry, we then look for volunteers to then impart that knowledge from the pro gamers come along to give talks. The other big one we do a lot outreach to is with universities. We have in the UK a National University Esports League, which has 110 universities with it and about 3,000 players. And then we then go out to some of those universities and give talks there as well about esports and what opportunities and things there.
Perhaps if I use an example to just give a bit more color to, I think, to this question. When we first started, we partnered with the largest media company in Singapore. We created the largest gaming event, which included a lot of esports. So every year we would have 250,000 people come out to the event, and it was great. We filled out expo halls. It was wonderful. But then we asked ourselves hard questions. Is this something that we should be doing? And how can we deepen the engagement? And we found it challenging. We found it difficult in such a large expo event to really deepen the engagement. And we said that this is great. In fact, it helps our coffers as well, right? But is this something that we should be doing? In the industry can do it. Players like ESL and all these guys can come in and they can do some of these things. It may not necessarily be our job. So we took that event. We took a very painful decision to stop the event, at least our participation in it. And then we went to a campus event. So we went to each school and we evangelized, hey, come on. So this weekend, actually, I'm rushing back tomorrow. We are running a campus event. And this campus event is held at one of the tertiary institutes in Singapore. And we tour all the tertiary institutes, and then it culminates. And it's a much smaller event. The outreach is only 10,000 compared to 200,000. But it's strategic. It's important to us, as to the question that you raised. And it allows us to deepen. For one, we don't have to worry so much about renting expensive hall spaces. So then with that financial pressure off, it allows us to really deepen how we engage and work in the school and with the gamers.
Okay, thank you. I think that is going to conclude our question and answer time. Wish we did have more time, but as we transition into our lunch period, there will be plenty of time. If you see any of these gentlemen around, then feel free to ask any questions that you have. And in light of that, I'd like to ask for a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you very much.